Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Eco Promo 2.0 and what it means for the promo industry by Ashley Crawford from Promo Collection. Today you are listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed for you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to Ashley by typing them into the questions pane on the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time and we will collect these and address them during the session. To give you a brief introduction on today's presenter, Ashley Crawford is the Head of Sales and Marketing at Promo Collection and is always striving to bring the latest in promo and marketing ideas from around the globe to his customers in the Australian market. Prior to joining the Promo Collection team, he worked in a number of marketing and e-commerce positions globally. Welcome, Ashley.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon to Eco Promo 2.0 and what it means for the promo industry. Okay. So thanks, Sabina, for the introduction. So myself, I've been with Promo Collection about 2.5 years. During that time, constantly searching for new products and analysing trends. And Eco Promo, I know it's a very hot word at the moment. It's definitely the buzzword in the industry. So it's something that's I'm definitely interested about, and I wanted to use this opportunity to share some of the things that I've discovered while researching into the eco promo trends. So in terms of this webinar, I want to make it interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, as Sabina mentioned, please send them through and I'll try and address them either during the webinar or at the end. Also, the webinar video will be posted on the APA YouTube channel later on, so you can view it there. Also, if you want a copy of the presentation itself, I'll put my contact details up at the end of the presentation and feel free to drop me a line. So I've put a lot of questions through this presentation because, as I said, I want to try and make it interactive as possible. So during the presentation, feel free to jump in the chat box and try and, I want to hear everyone's opinions on some of these issues. But firstly, before we start, does anyone have any questions about eco promo that they'd like me to address throughout the presentation? I'll make a note of them and I'll try and address them as we go through the different sections. So if you have anything, feel free to type it into your message box there. Okay, well, I'll wait for everyone's questions to come through, but as you're doing that, I'll just kick off the presentation. So firstly, why do this webinar? So everyone knows that eco-friendly is the buzzword in the industry at the moment. But what does it mean for your customers and what does it mean for you as a distributor or even as a supplier in the industry? So the first question I want to pose to everyone is, so this whole eco trend, it could be seen from two different perspectives. So either as a risk, because as we heard at the APA Leadership Forum a few months back, there's a risk that the promo industry will become a byword for cheap and plasticky. Or is it an opportunity that is something that we can embrace and even drive change as an industry? So you can type in the chat box now, what do people think this new trend is for the industry? Okay. Yep. Okay. So I think looking at the industry as a whole, I think even though it's a risk, it's definitely a great opportunity for the industry, and I see it as something that the industry is already embracing. And I'll explain more of that as we go through this presentation. So today's presentation, I've tried to break down the eco promo trends into 3 areas. So I call them the pre-eco era. So I picked a time 5 years ago, back in 2014. Then the current era, which I've labelled as the single-use replacement era for eco promo. And then I've also, based on current trends and government policy, I've had a stab at predicting where the industry will be going in the next 5 years. So the key objectives of this presentation is to share these key trends with you. So when customers come to you and ask questions, you have the knowledge and ability to be able to answer their questions, and also to try and get to the bottom of some of the key terminology in the industry. Because as you've probably seen following the media, a lot of the terms, the definition isn't quite widely agreed across the industry yet. So that's something we'll try and drill down into. So we'll start off with what I call the pre-eco promo era. So I picked a time 5 years ago. So if we think back 5 years ago in 2014, so Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, seems like a long time ago already. On a typical day, you might have packed the kids' lunch, you used plastic wrap for that. Your morning coffee, you had it in a disposable cup. For lunch, you probably used a single-use straw. And when you went shopping, you didn't think anything of grabbing lots of single-use bags, which accumulated at home. And some customers may have been approaching you and asking about eco promo, but when you did your research and tried to source the products, a lot of the time the cost was a major issue. And the technology wasn't quite there 5 years ago. So I'll put out the question now, what do people think has changed in the last 5 years in the industry? Okay. So moving forwards to present day, we're in what I call the Eco Promo 1.0. So 1.0 denotes that it's still early days in this Eco Promo trend development. And I label this as the single-use replacement era. So if we have a look now, 5 years later, we've got a new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. A lot of the states have actually made a move in banning plastic bags. Finally, New South Wales recently has also jumped on the bandwagon for that. Recent news articles talked about South Australia banning the use of single-use cutlery in their state. So that's probably something else that looks like it's going to spread. Plastic straws, we're seeing campaigns against those. Coffee cups. We've also seen a lot more media attention in terms of TV programs. The War on Waste is probably one of the most famous ones. And in terms of client interaction, so I'm sure a lot of you are getting clients coming to you and directly asking, what's the latest in eco promo? Because it's something that's on at the front of everyone's minds. So when I look at this shift, I think it can be summarized well in something called the waste management hierarchy. So it sounds a very technical term, but it's simply, if you look at this upside down triangle, so previously the focus would have been on recycling waste. So everyone knew that your plastic bottles, your glass bottles, they could be recycled. And that was the way that we dealt with waste. But now in 2019, the trend is definitely a shift to avoid and reduce waste. So in terms of what has driven this shift, there's a few key reasons for this. One is that recycling, it can't be disposed of like it could in the past. So traditionally, a lot of recycling was shipped all the way around the world, so to China and other countries. But that market is nearly dried up overnight. They're not willing to accept the waste. So a lot of recycled goods are just stockpiling or even going to landfill in Australia. Also, I think from a common sense perspective, it makes more sense to avoid creating the waste if you can, rather than trying to manage it afterwards. So when we look at the Eco Promo 1.0, we see the replacement of single-use items. So probably one of the earlier ones was the coffee cups, so replacing it with the Kid Cup or the other glass coffee cups. The straws, so replacing with the silicone or stainless steel or wood versions. Then the bags, so going from plastic to the non-woven totes, things like that. Some of the new ones, which you'll see coming out over the next few months, some are already out, is replacing the things like the cling wrap with a pouch So you can do brandable pouches for those. The produce bags. So when I go to the supermarket now, I either don't use the produce bags or I reuse the reusable ones, just another way of cutting down plastic. And then the utensils, which, as I mentioned, South Australia as a state is looking to ban. So fast forward now to Eco-Promo 2.0. So this is based on current trends and government regulations where I see the industry moving over the next 5 years. And I've called this the eco-materials era. So if we go back to this slide, one thing that we notice is it's the replacement of single-use products with reusable products, but for the most part, they're not made of biodegradable or eco-friendly materials. So that's something that I see changing going forwards in the next 5 years. So something that you may or may not have heard of, but it's something that's definitely going to influence the promotional products industry. So this was last few years, the federal government back in 2017 had a target: 100% of Australian packaging be recyclable, compostable, or reusable by 2025. So this is going to be delivered by the Packaging Covenant organisation. So all the major supermarkets and food producers have signed up to this. So this is something that's already happening. And proof that it's happening, I've just taken one example. I could have taken one of any out of those 950, but Aldi, because I came across an article. So they're talking about reducing plastic packaging. They're going to axe it by 1/4. Also, some of the buzzwords that they've used here. So they've talked about being recyclable, reusable, or compostable. Also, some of the acronyms they've used. So that all paper will be FSC, PEFC, or 70% recycled by that time. So from this perspective, I think if the whole supermarket and food production industries are moving in this direction, this is something that's definitely going to affect the promotional products industry. But at the same time, looking at this statement, there's a lot of buzzwords in there and also a lot of acronyms. So I'll be breaking those down the next few pages. So we probably found when we talk about eco-promo, maybe in the past few years, it was enough to say something was eco-friendly. But why exactly was it eco-friendly? That's something that customers will be challenging you on more and more going forwards. So there's a lot of words in here. Some of them, the meaning is still being quite openly debated. And the one I'll pick here is biodegradable. So everyone probably has some sort of concept of what biodegradable is. But I think if you look at this next slide, it'll become a bit of a shock. So I think if we talk about biodegradable, we think eco-friendly products that will disappear into the ground eventually. But if we look at this chart, actually everything is eventually biodegradable, which raises the question, why do we even use the word if even the most unenvironmentally friendly products like plastic bottles and fishing rods eventually biodegrade? So that's something that actually the Australian industry is grappling with at the moment. So a very fresh example of this is, some of you may have seen in the media, Woolworths was sued by the ACCC for using the word biodegradable for their cutlery and plates. And it all came down to, what does the term biodegradable actually mean? So this is something that your customers will be asking you more and more going forwards. So if we have a look at these terms, recyclable, everyone's quite familiar, that term's been around a long time. So you can reproduce the goods into something, a new product sometime in the future. But what about degradable, biodegradable, and compostable? So I'll openly admit this wasn't something that I was clear about, the difference between these terms, when I started researching this presentation. And this is something, if you look online, there's a lot of different definitions around, but I can summarize it to try and separate the three terms for you. So degradable basically means that the product will break down into smaller pieces over time. So, for example, even just a regular plastic bag will still degrade, but it will leave microplastics in the soil. So it's made from a non-organic materials. Biodegradable means that the product has both organic and non-organic components, and that it will break down over time. So the definition of biodegradability, which is something I mentioned that Woolworths has been sued over just recently, there's an Australian standard, which I've listed on the right there, which you can quote to your customers. So must achieve 90% biodegradation of plastic materials within 180 days. So because it's such a broad term, it tries to give some sort of definition to give the term meaning. And compostable, I think we're all quite familiar with. So compostable, if you put fully organic products in the ground, then they'll disappear into organic material. So if you put an apple into the ground, it should be gone within a certain amount of time. So as I mentioned, Alidy's statement, they're using a lot of acronyms, and this is something that you'll get asked about more and more from customers as well. So the FSC, it stands for the Forest Stewardship Council, PEFC, Program for the Endorsement of Forests and Certification. So these two organisations, as far as I can tell, they're quite similar. So not-for-profits, and they give some sort of definition to the sourcing of paper products. And then they track that and certify it through all chains in the supply chain, or all links in the supply chain. So from timber sourcing, paper production, printing and retailing, to make sure that it meets their standards. So potentially you might have customers asking for paper bags that are FSC certified. So that's what that means. And that's something that will become more and more mainstream going forwards. Something else that you may see more and more of, this has already started, and I predict this trend to greatly accelerate going forwards, is material compounds. So what does that mean? So we've all seen the Keep Cup. It was initially the replacement for the single-use cup, but recently, the last year or two, the bamboo fibre or the wheat husk or different compounds, that's the next trend going forwards. So this is part of the eco-materials trend that I see continuing. So something to note when you're looking at these eco-materials is they'll have the material itself, so that'll be something organic, so wheat husk, rice husk, bamboo fibre, for example. Then that powder needs to be bound with something, so that's called the binding agent. So you'll have different plastics or glues that are used to bind it together. Then another thing to look out for when you're buying these products is the ratio of the mix. So I'm not a chemical and engineering background, but to put it simply, the higher the ratio of the binding agent or the glue, the product will be more durable, but it'll be less biodegradable. And then the inverse is true as well on that. Okay, so that brings to the end my presentation for today. So just in summary, I see the promo products industry. There was the 5 years ago that eco promo was too expensive, and there was a lack of demand from customers. Now in 2019, there's definitely demand, but the trend generally is to replace single-use products with reusable products. But for the most part, they're not eco-friendly materials themselves. But going forwards, because of regulations and the direction of the industry, eco-materials era will be coming. So here's my details. As I mentioned, if you want to get a copy of this presentation, feel free to drop me a line. Also, there's links to our company, and we have an eco-friendly products catalogue that we can produce a custom version of. So I'll pass it over to Sabina. Were there any questions there, Sabina?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Ashley. We do have a question here. If you'd just like to recap, so it's a little bit of a long one. So Diana has asked, how do you see single-use items like lanyards and event name badges for conferences becoming more sustainable? I've tried to find eco-friendly recyclable options for one of my clients, And through my research, I found once they've been printed, they can't be recycled either, and sublimation or screen printed inks, with sublimation or screen printed inks. With suppliers starting to use eco-friendly printing inks will suppliers start to use eco-friendly printing inks that will biodegrade? Whilst PET is a product from recycling, it cannot be recycled again, so still a single-use item that ends up in landfill. I'll hand that one back to you.
Yeah, that's a long question, but a very good one. And this is something that we come across every day. So to try and answer the question, so there's a few, when you're looking at these products, there's actually a few elements. So the lanyard is a good example. So you've got the material that the lanyard is made of. So there are some more eco-friendly materials. So you mentioned, there's the PET bottles. There's also bamboo fiber that can be used for that. But at the same time, it's always going to be a material compound, because you can imagine if you're using, say, bamboo fiber or some other fiber, it needs to be bound together with something. So at the moment, we haven't seen the technology that something like a lanyard could be fully biodegradable. The next challenge, as you mentioned as well, is the print side of things. So this is something that will move over time. Like when I was talking about the paper bags with the FSC, so the Forestry Stewardship Council, having that certification at all links of the supply chain, they actually ensure that it's not only when the materials are sourced, but the print that's used is eco-friendly, and also that the retailing and other links in that supply chain are eco-friendly. And finally, you talk about the attachment. So again, we do a lot of lanyards, so we know the attachments are made of metal, which isn't an easily recyclable material, and it won't biodegrade easily as well. So I think that going forward, I can't give you a definitive answer now, but I see going forwards that there's always going to be a trade-off between sort of the reliability of the product and how eco-friendly it can be. And at the moment, it's still probably skewed more towards the reliability side than being fully biodegradable or eco-friendly. So I think at the moment, the best you can do is to try and, one, either encourage them to reuse the lanyard, or two, specifically talk to your supplier about trying to get some more eco-friendly materials and trying to minimize that impact. Were there any other questions there, Sabina?
Yes, I've just had one more pop through now. So we've had Andrea ask, do you have any ideas for packaging, for example, metal pens that are wrapped in plastic now to protect the print in transit or storage?
Yeah, there's another very good question. So I was thinking of raising this one. So we do some eco-friendly products, say a bamboo fiber cup. And the factories, by default, they put it in the OPP bag, just like a plastic bag. And some customers they'll raise that, oh, it's an eco-friendly product, but you put it in a plastic bag. And in the past, we have removed the bags at the request of customers, but then sometimes you get damage to the product in shipment, because we all know what the couriers are, international and local couriers are like. So at the moment, I think that's still something that the factories need to catch on to, that they can't just wrap everything in plastic just to make it shipping safe and to try and improve the durability of the product. For that, there are definitely other alternatives in terms of, you could use some sort of cornstarch bag or some other bag, but then, and we come across this sometimes, when we get a quote on that, the cost could be 5, 10, or even 20 cents per bag, and then the customers balk at it. So I think it's something that consciousness is coming, but at the moment, the factories haven't caught on, and then also the cost is something that deters customers. But there definitely are options there if you're willing to spend the money.
Okay, Ashley, I've got another 2 questions here for you, so I'll go one by one. So the first one is from Carl. He's asked, do you expect a shift from single-use notebooks to reusable notebooks for events and conferences?
Okay, yeah. So the notebooks, I think the nature of the paper, unless you treat it with something, is probably going to be more single use. But I think that the notebooks as a whole are probably the more eco-friendly ones, especially if you're getting some that are, the covers are made by from recycled paper and things like that. So probably the only biodegradable part of those notebooks would be potentially the print, and then if you had some sort of plasticky covering on the outside. So I think that trend will stick around, but probably shift towards more eco-friendly options with recycled paper and things like that.
Okay, we've also got, so Amelia has asked or even suggested tissue paper wrapped around the product could possibly work. And we have a question from Matt who's asked, do you see compliance as becoming more of a factor in customers' decisions in the future as well, regarding safety/ethical worker treatment?
Sure. So first address the tissue paper. I mean, that's a great idea. But as I mentioned at the moment, the factories that produce these products, by default, they'll use the plastic bag. So that invariably there'll be some sort of extra cost or effort that's required to wrap it in some other material. But that's something you can definitely talk to your supplier about, and something that customers raise with us. Yeah, so there's definitely other alternatives there. And then in terms of the last one was compliance, in terms of environmental and ethical standards. Yeah, so this is something we get asked about quite often. I can't speak for other suppliers in the industry, but ourselves, we work with larger factories who have that certification. So there is one of the most common ones is called SEDEX, so the 4P, so the 4 pillars of SEDEX. So it's labour, environment, I forget what the other two were, but that's something that we get asked more and more. So a customer will say, oh, I want to source this pen, but I want it with this certification as well. So that's something you can talk to your suppliers, and a lot of people talk to us about, and you can get certification by independent third-party bodies who will be able to give you that assurance.
Okay, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you everybody for your questions. Obviously a really important discussion that we're having today, and thank you very much, Ashley, for taking the time to give us this presentation and go over all the stats. I'm sure it's a conversation that we will continue to have in the industry. If you did have any further questions for Ashley after the presentation, if something pops into mind, Ashley has listed his details on the screen there, and also you're more than welcome to email myself. We will have this presentation available for you, and it'll be emailed to you tomorrow. And once again, thank you, Ashley, for your time today.
Okay, thanks guys.